Welcome. My name is Mads. I'm a consultant at Zangenberg Analytics, and I'll be presenting alongside Adrian.
Yeah, Adrian Møller, Zangenberg Analytics. Mainly responsible for the benchmarking model, and we are going to talk about ITO today.
What we'll go through today is we will start out by discussing the current trends in the ITO market. What are the things that are most important to clients and vendors at this moment, and what impacts does this have on the prices on the ITO market? Then we'll get into a bit of what we call ITO sourcing scenarios. That is, some of the effects of the current trends mean that we see some clients choosing to make the changes to their sourcing strategies. Then we will discuss another effect of the current trends, which is a prioritization of cost out and cost avoidance initiatives, and we will make some points on how you can approach that. And then at the end we will do some wrapping up and discuss when should you renegotiate your operations agreements.
Yes. And spoiler alert, the time is now. You can always renegotiate. But let's kick off with the trends, and just before we really get into what we want to talk about today, let's just set the scene a little bit. So when we say ITO, what exactly are we talking about? And I assume most of you out there, you already know the IT stack. You also know the services all the way from housing service to end user services, service desk and support and so on. And the point here is not that we're going to explain the whole IT stack, but in order to really understand the trends the main trend that we're going to talk about today, which is increasing software prices, you do need to understand where in the IT stack this really affects the services and also the costs. So the four primary cost drivers in IT are basically hardware, software, salaries, and power. And in the past year, basically software has been on everybody's mind, maybe also going back more than 1 year. But what we're going to talk about today is basically how we are seeing the effects in the ITO market. So a lot of these services have been affected by the increasing software prices, specifically the Broadcom, the VMware situation affecting the virtualization software, but also Microsoft price hikes affecting operating system licenses, SQL licenses, and so on. And that's basically going to be the key point today. So just setting the scene here, and then let's get into it.
Yes, so as Adrian says, the number one topic when discussing trends in the ITO market is the prices of software. And this is the case both in outsourcing agreements, but also for people who have insourced their IT operations. And as Adrian says, the prime example is the acquisition of VMware by Broadcom, which has led to many companies receiving price increases of 500 to 1,000%. And obviously we brought some examples of other large software vendors who are pushing the prices up. But this is something which is impacting all parts of the market, but it will not impact all parts of the market equally. And we will also get back to that when discussing some of the sourcing scenarios which may be forced upon clients due to the price increases.
Yeah, and the main trend that we're talking about is going to be increased software prices, but there are other things that we have seen in the market in the past year. Security and compliance is on the top of mind. The increased software prices have led to renewed interest in open source alternatives. And then we're also seeing a changed approach to the public cloud and an interest in European alternatives there.
Yes, and if we start off a bit by talking about security and compliance, there's a lot of our customers and clients on the ITO market are have to be compliant with the new DORA and NIS2 regulation, and this is something which is top of mind for a lot of vendors and a lot of clients, also in their internal discussions and in their negotiations, and the clients want to make sure that the vendors are compliant with these regulations. Our experience is that the regulation is not something which is difficult for most vendors to comply with. So it's not a major, our experience that these TOW or DORA regulations are something which impacts the prices by a lot. Something in the security area which might impact the prices by a lot is increasing the amount of security services which you want to include in your operations agreement. And something we see a lot is, for example, the inclusion of a security operations center or a managed detection and response service and stuff like that, which is obviously something which was not previously a part of a standard ITO outsourcing agreement, but which is included in more and more agreements going forward. Yes.
And if we're looking at the open source, what we're seeing, basically with the whole geopolitical situation that we're going to talk a little bit about, is that people are looking for alternatives to the large American software vendors. And I mean, if you just look at the media, you will see Computer World writing about the German government pushing open source and so on. And we are experiencing this a lot from all of our clients. Basically, they're looking for how can we change away from VMware, for example, how can we change away from Microsoft? Can we actually use LibreOffice? And I mean, this is not really a new thing, but it seems like in the past year, it has really renewed the interest around this topic.
Yeah, and this is obviously a combination of increases in prices from the large software vendors and also the geopolitical situation, which we will get back to.
Yeah, and the final thing that we're not really deep diving in today, but we are going to write in the market overview, which is coming soon for all you quarterly analytics subscribers, is also the changed approach to the public cloud. I think it's not really news anymore that there's no more cloud first in the market. But one thing that we are at least a little bit new to us is the increased focus on the European alternatives to the big three. And we actually have done some calculations where we compare the prices between Amazon, Google, and AWS to some of the European alternatives such as Hetzner, UpCloud, Scaleway, and some others. And that we're actually going to talk a little bit more about that in the market overview. And we do have some interesting observations there, because we're actually seeing that a lot of these European alternatives have lower costs, not just on compute, but also offering much lower or even free egress costs, which is one of those things that can really drive your cloud cost and lead to some ugly surprises there. So there's some quite interesting things there going on.
Yes, and when discussing these three trends, they are something which we discuss. Like Adrian said, it's not all new, but it's something which is very top of mind at the moment. And this is partly due to the geopolitical situation at the moment. And obviously the relationship between the European nations and the United States in particular has been complicated over the past few months. And this is something which has led a lot of clients to discuss, well, what do we need to do to enhance our IT security and make sure that the right people have access to our data? What open source alternatives do we have to the larger American corporations, and how can we establish plan Bs if in case of major price increases? And also, obviously, a lot of, like Adrian said, the major public cloud providers, they are based out of the US, and this geopolitical uncertainty has caused clients to consider how dependent do we want to be in relation to American vendors.
And basically, those are the trends, but now we're going to move on to basically the effects that we're seeing from a lot of these trends. And one of the things that we're seeing directly in the contracts and RFPs that we've been doing is that there's basically a changed dialogue between the suppliers and the customers, where increased transparency around software costs is something that they're both bringing up, because neither the customer side nor the supplier side really wants to bear all of the risk of the increasing software prices. So they're trying to deal with this problem together. And we're seeing that there are contracts where the software costs are deliberately singled out, and there's a new level of transparency that we haven't seen before. So before, I mean, you just get, here's the price of a server, but now you can break it down to not only the server capacity, but also the licenses and the operations part. And that's quite interesting. We're also seeing that there are new ways of regulating this. It's deliberately put into the contracts if the software costs increase by more than the netto price index. I forget what that's called in English, but basically it's entering all the contracts out there, and it's basically something that they're both trying to deal with. And we're seeing also pretty much directly, it seems, from the VMware situation that suppliers are offering differentiated pricing on their server operations. So you can purchase server operations based on VMware for one price, and then you have another price if you choose to accept and migrate to a different setup based on open source alternatives, for example.
Yes, another effect of the software prices is what we will get back to in detail later, but it's what we will call a re-evaluation of sourcing strategies. And a sourcing strategy, it outlines basically how have you chosen to which services have you chosen to outsource, which services have you chosen to perform by yourself, and how many vendors are you using, and which vendors are you using to deliver all of the services. And the increasing software prices can directly impact how preferable, you can say, an insourced IT department might be, because if you are a smaller client, then you might not be a desired customer for VMware after being acquired by Broadcom, which means that you are presented with price increases which are extremely high. And in such situations, you might see the larger outsourcing vendors having a better agreement with VMware, and thus being able to offer you a preferable price to the cost of performing the activities yourselves.
And I think that's actually a key point, is that basically these effects are not hitting all parts of the market the same. And it's quite different if you have, for example, insourced operations versus outsourced operations, because the large suppliers have been able to keep the VMware prices in check. But if you're a small client, you're gonna have a bad time, basically.
Yeah, and this is a direct. I mean, as a direct result of this, this is also a parameter in which the different vendors can compete against each other. It will be a massive advantage if you have had the ability to negotiate a good agreement with a company like VMware, because you will be able to afford much cheaper prices to your customers. The final effect we will discuss from increasing software prices is we see a prioritization of cost out initiatives. And this is a pretty intuitive one, as see a lot of clients might not be able to establish a short-term alternative to critical software such as virtualization software, and they are therefore looking to find other ways to reduce costs on their operations agreement or even in their internal IT department. And this is why we're seeing a lot of companies look into cost out, specifically in IT. How can we reduce the overall cost associated with our ITO agreement?
And I mean, the focus for the rest of the presentation is going to be a lot about, first we're going to talk about sourcing, and then we're going to talk about cost out initiatives. And we are going to really dive deep into the sourcing. We're going to bring you a client example where you can actually see how large an impact this had on their setup. And then we're going to afterwards talk about cost out initiatives and some of the, at least from a client perspective, things you can do to cut your costs, basically.
Yes. So we will start off by discussing what we call the sourcing scenarios. And obviously, we have discussed the market trends. There's some geopolitical uncertainty, the increasing software prices, the increased focus on IT security. And what might this do to your sourcing strategy? Well, what we see is a lot of clients are reviewing their vendor dependencies. This is basically a way of saying, well, we are no longer as sure as we were previously that the current vendors are those who we want to use in the future, and they are looking to make plans at least to how could we switch to another vendor due to either price increases or geopolitical issues. And the other part, which we will bring an example of in a moment, is that the market dynamics here, which we have discussed, might force smaller companies into outsourcing. And this is a direct result of receiving a price increase which your current budgets just cannot absorb. And you might find a preferable or cheaper alternative in outsourcing to vendors with better software pricing.
Yeah, and first, before we get into basically the more framework discussion that we have on how to go about dealing with your sourcing strategy and getting your baseline correct, we're going to talk about this case example that we have from a medium-sized company facing a VMware renewal. And this is a case that is basically brand new. This company had a long-standing agreement with VMware, and their licenses expired in November of 2024. And they basically anticipated, yes, the costs are probably going to increase, but otherwise it's going to be pretty much a standard renewal. They've been using the perpetual licenses for many years. And other than that, they were also, and that's quite important actually in this case, they were also looking at a hardware renewal and a modernization of one of the existing server rooms. But what happened, which was, pretty insane, if you ask us, is that not only did they face a 500% increase, so an increase from 375,000 to almost 2 million on their VMware license, when they actually decided to accept this, and they said, okay, well, this price increase is, it's insane, but we don't really have the power to deal with this right now, so we're just going to reluctantly accept. Broadcom did not even want to sell them a new license, so they actually ignored their requests when they said, okay, we're going to accept this quote. Even when they tried to contact them through their license reseller, there was just no response, and the reseller said, well, that's how it is now. And that's pretty wild if you ask us. So that forced them to reevaluate what were their options, and there are a lot of listed scenarios that they decided to investigate, but basically we helped them they shortlisted 4 scenarios, and then we helped them look at what would be the cost in each of these scenarios. So, I mean, obviously the first scenario was continuing as is. The second scenario that we looked at was changing the technology on their on-premise setup. We looked at rehosting with a sourcing partner, and then we also looked at the Azure VMware solution because they already had some competencies using Azure. And basically these were the results. So if you're just starting off with scenario 0, so right now their current costs of server storage, database operations, including operation of the housing and the data center, so that was about 3.4 million. And with the increase in VMware licensing costs and also modernization of one of their data centers, well, the total cost increase was 88%, so from 3.4 to 6.4 million. And basically the scenario 1, which was continuing as is, was basically not really an option. Not only due to the cost, but because that Broadcom didn't even actually renew their license. Well, they couldn't continue without any support on their setup. The next thing that we looked at was changing the technology on the on-premise setup, so looking for open source alternatives, and that actually what we found was together with them that this would lead to lower operational costs over time, but there was quite a significant investment in not only renewing the data center, but also retraining the staff, transitioning and the transformation of the IT environment. And that led to quite significant investments required. Finally, we looked at rehosting with a sourcing partner and the Azure VMware solution, and both of those were quite close in the end of the total costs. The capex expenditure there was quite a bit lower because they could actually just not renew one of their data center server rooms, and then they could rehost with the sourcing partner. They would also, they could keep some of their existing competencies and technologies and so on. So the transition efforts were quite a bit lower. And in the end, basically those were the 2 scenarios that were really the most interesting for this company. And after doing all these calculations, the big question was, well, which one should we choose? Because both scenario 2, 3, and 4 have some merit, basically. Scenario 2 would have quite a big impact on the internal organization, and there will be a lot of retraining. But the big thing there is that it was an opportunity to also renew a lot of their IT environment. But the biggest thing was probably that there would be no dependency on Broadcom afterwards, while when you rehosted with the sourcing partner, which was based on VMware, and the same with the Azure solution, you would still have that underlying dependency. And then it comes down to basically a matter of principle, and not just a cost exercise. And I think that's basically the segue to the next slide, because one of the first things that you want to do in order to be able to actually make these decisions is that you need to basically define your overall objectives and figure out what is more important. Is it independency of certain software providers, or is it actually just the lowest cost or whatever it is?
Yeah, so obviously when developing, and what you're seeing here is sort of our step-by-step process to developing a sourcing strategy. And as Adrian says, the first part is figuring out what's most important to us, because most clients want the cheapest possible agreement with the lowest amount of risk and the maximum amount of options in the future, right? But all of these things won't be possible at the same time. So the first part is to figure out what's most important. And for some companies, this might be to be independent of large American vendors. And for others, this might be truly just how do we get the lowest price and still have an agreement which provides what we need, right? The second step of developing the sourcing strategy is figuring out how much capacity is expected in the coming years. And what we are seeing is that we have a lot of clients who are rushing to figure out how much is capacity going to increase, because it has a large impact on how you can negotiate prices with the vendors, how much investment in hardware do you need to make, and stuff like that.
And it also, I mean, it factors into your decision in the way that if you expect that there might be a large capacity increase, but you're also going to need increased flexibility, well, that might lead to choosing, the outsource scenario, either with a sourcing partner or with a cloud hyperscaler. Whereas if you know that it's going to be quite steady, then you might be more inclined to continue with your on-premise setup and so on.
Yeah, so this is important to do early in the process, because when you move on to the next step, you need to map out who are the relevant vendors, what are the relevant options for us going forward. And this is directly connected to our point number 4, which is scenario generation. So as Adrian showed you on the previous slide, you need to map out, say, 1, 2, 3, 4 different alternatives and say, these are the options we have, and there can be a lot of variation between these scenarios, and some might be maximum outsourcing or maximum insourcing, stuff like that. But there can also be very small variations which can end up having a large impact either on the price or on the fulfillment of your strategic objectives, you can say. So you might have 2 scenarios which are very even in price, but where one of them might make you dependent on a vendor which you would rather avoid being dependent on, so to say. And then the next step you say is you should do target pricing. You should figure out, well, how much do we expect these scenarios to end up costing? And then the final part is you analyze the scenarios from the strategic perspective while keeping an eye on the objectives which you set out early in the process, right? So you do what we call the SWOT analysis. You figure out what is the strengths, what is the weaknesses, opportunities, and threats for all of the scenarios. And finally, you will have a good basis to make the decision on in which direction should we go for our sourcing strategy. And this decision will be based on both overall strategic objectives and target pricing, of course, and then strengths and weaknesses of the different scenarios.
And I think an important point here is also that, as we're saying, the increased software prices and the geopolitical situation have forced clients to evaluate. So while maybe some of their prognosis and the scenarios haven't really changed that much, I mean, of course, some of the target pricing might have changed. It's basically the objectives that have been affected here, and that leads to change decisions in the end.
Yeah, you might have the exact same objectives that you might have implicitly had 5 years ago when you chose your current way of sourcing, but the outside circumstances have now means that you are no longer living up to that objective by continuing with an as-is scenario, right? So that's why we say it's important to reevaluate this, especially if you are seeing your cost increase by a lot, or if you have issues with vendor dependencies in this time.
Yeah, and I think the key word there is, I mean, that also the buzzword maybe that everybody is talking about is data sovereignty, which is really hard to say as a Dane, but basically independency of the large critical American vendors there.
Yeah, you want to be in control of your own data.
Yeah.
So this what you're looking at here is basically our framework for creating, for the final view of a sourcing strategy. And what you're seeing in the left column of the table is all of the activities connected, associated with operating a system or operating the company workstations or network and stuff like that. And to the right, you see the different systems or different IT applications which the company has. And what we'll say is that it's important to have this overview, or at least have a good knowledge of how this looks for your company, because especially in a time like this, it's important that these are a result of an active decision, and you're sure that this is looking the exact way which you want it to.
Mm. And this is what we call the sourcing baseline, and you can probably imagine that this can be applied to basically pretty much any organization. You just change what are the systems or what are the system domains. It could also be a group of systems. Then you map it out for each area. And I mean, you'd be surprised sometimes the things that you realize if you do this kind of exercise at a large organization. Sometimes you will realize that you have a lot of different vendors. You might also realize that there are some things that were outsourced or insourced that you didn't even know about. You have one system which is kind of gone rogue and built their own data center. I mean, we have some pretty extreme examples of this. But just having the complete sourcing baseline is quite important to make the right decisions here.
Yes, and sometimes when we are with clients, what we see is actually that the sourcing baseline sort of outlines some of the issues which people in the organization are describing, right? Mm. So you might say for one system that people are saying it's a bit unclear who's actually performing the maintenance, and they feel that it's not going well because they keep sending emails to different departments and you don't really know who's doing it. And then when you map out the sourcing baseline, you see that the responsibility is shared between 3 to 4 different places. Mm. And this is something that you want to avoid.
Yeah.
Yes. So, discussing the dependencies on large American vendors, this is something that you can do with the framework that we just showed, and especially if you can answer yes to the 3 questions on the left, right? So, is your data located outside the EU? Is your data handled by non-EU entities? Or are you critically dependent on US software? And if you can answer yes to all of these questions, we believe you should look into mapping out the sourcing baseline and maybe reevaluating your sourcing strategy with the step-by-step process that we showed previously. Mm. And as we write on the bottom also, we have a webcast from March the 4th where you can dig into a lot more on this topic. But basically what's important is map out your plan Bs and your sourcing baseline.
Yeah, and you can actually, I mean, this framework that we're using here, you can use it for a lot of different things, because one thing is that you can show the outsourced versus insourced view. But when you do this, you can also note who are actually the vendors involved in each business domain or system area. And then you can apply a format like this way. Okay, so who of these vendors that we have are actually hosting data outside the EU or maybe even an American software vendor. And then you can actually see where in your sourcing baseline are you dependent on this kind of vendor. And this is quite good to get an overall overview of your dependencies.
Yeah, and an overview like this is also if you are reevaluating your sourcing strategy and you want to generate some different scenarios and you are discussing, well, what are options in different ways? This is a good overview to look at to say, well, in this case, you might look at the system 2 and say, well, that's a critical dependency. Let's generate a scenario where we move this from an American to a Danish vendor. And let's have a scenario where we don't do that, and you calculate the different target pricing, you go through the SWOT analysis, you map it out against the strategic objectives, and now you have a good basis on which to decide what to do with this in the future. So the main point here is that you should be actively selecting the right suppliers for the right activities based on strategic objectives, target pricing, and SWOT analysis.
Yeah. Yes, so that was a little bit about some of the ITO sourcing scenarios, and I mean, the reason that we are talking about this is, I mean, the one client example that we showed you, it's something that we're getting a lot of right now, right? And we basically believe that everybody should be prepared to at least have mapped out the alternatives and know their best alternative to the negotiated agreements and so on. The next thing that we're going to talk about is, as we said, that these increased software prices have led a lot of clients out there to basically look for cost out initiatives. I mean, you have also in the media, you have the large regions. We're getting a lot of demand for cost out initiatives. We have made a webcast on this not too long ago, but we're still going to touch about it today and basically show our framework for going into this, which we're going to go into now.
Yes, and obviously when discussing cost out, there's a lot of these initiatives where it might be difficult to reduce cost, but it's also important in the cost avoidance context, right? So how can you avoid the overall costs increasing in the future? So yeah, great. All right, so now you're looking at sort of an empty chart, which we will start filling out with different ways of approaching cost out. What you're seeing on the x-axis is, well, how can you prioritize the different ways of going about cost out, and on the y-axis you're looking at how big is the impact on the organization, right? So if you have something in the upper right corner, this might have a very large impact on the cost, but it will also have a very large impact on the organization.
Yeah, and I mean the first step, I think we have 8 steps on our staircases here, is a quite simple optimization, efficiency improvement, which isn't going to have basically any impact on the existing organization. While when we get to some of the later steps, it's going to require quite tough decisions, and it's going to have large impact on the organization. So that's the framework that we work in here with here. And the first step that we always look at when we are going into IT cost out is right sizing. So can you cut some of the underutilized resources, and that could be in the existing on-premise setups. You can maybe right-size that to avoid more investments in additional hardware, but it can also be more direct if you're looking at something like a cloud environment with cloud FinOps, where you can actually get savings right now and not just cost avoidance from decreased investments in the future.
Yeah, so the point of the placement on the chart is basically that, that this has almost no impact on your organization, and it's the low-hanging fruit, so to say.
Yeah, and I mean, I think that one important distinction there is that it can still have a significant impact on your costs, but it's not going to mean that you need to make decisions on services that you can't offer, or people that you need to fire, or what you might imagine there.
The next part, moving up the staircase a bit, is right pricing, right? So here we are talking about negotiating with your vendors. How can we attain lower prices on the contracts. And there might be a lot of ways you can do this by, and we will get back to that a bit later, but you can look into changing some of the contract terms, making sure that you are only paying for what you actually want, right? You can use benchmarking, for example, to figure out, are we paying the right price for these services, even with decreasing prices over time, stuff like that. But this is a larger effort than the right sizing, because you need to involve the vendors, you need to renegotiate contracts. Yes.
Yeah, and just a shameless plug there, if you are a Quarterly Analytics subscriber, don't hesitate to reach out for a health check of your contract. If it's something that we do have some data on, we will let you know whether it's a red, yellow, or a green contract that you need to look into. The next step that we have here in the staircase, we're talking about automation and using technology to decrease demand of certain services. As you can imagine, this will require not only a larger effort, but it will also have a larger impact on the existing organization.
Yeah, and you can say, where can you implement automation? There's some people we're seeing some clients do this a lot inside of service desks, for example, right? You can people are implementing chatbots to do simple tasks automatically and stuff like that. The next one is offshoring or nearshoring of services, and this is obviously has an impact on cost, because all vendors will have cheaper prices for resources which are based either on the nearshore or especially offshore. But it also can have a pretty big impact on your organization if you need to live with the fact that you are using offshore resources in the service desk. You might not be able to speak Danish with the service desk, or you might simply, if you are shutting down an internal organization or an insourcing of a task and moving it offshore, that will also have a pretty big organizational impact.
And I think, the next step here is standardization, and you could probably discuss for step 3, 4, and 5 exactly which one that you might go with as the first one, but you should go through each step and consider all the different options that you have. And on the 5th step, we're looking at standardization, so that means removing individual variability in demanded services, standardizing your offerings, standardizing the services, and so on. And we'll get more into some of the specifics of what we mean with these things, but
yeah, let's move on.
Yeah.
And then there's the quality reduction, which is, it might seem pretty basic, but there might be some services which you are purchasing either externally or delivering internally, which you just choose to accept a lower quality. And this could be a lower SLA for a contract, for example. That is objectively moving from an availability demand of 99.5 to 99.0 is objectively a reduction in quality. However, the chosen SLA should be a result of the active decision. That is, how much do we need, and how much is we willing to pay for. So this is basically saying you should only pay the premium for premium services in the places where it's required from a business perspective or from a compliance perspective or stuff like that.
And before we're getting to the final step, this is one of the more drastic ones, which is basically you're looking at moving services to others. In a large company, this can be pushing costs from IT out into the business units, but it can also be scenarios where you're looking at insourcing versus outsourcing and so on. And I think the final step, which is the most drastic one, is and where you really need to prioritize and make the difficult decisions. That's where you're looking at, okay, this whole service area, is it something that we should just decommission? And of course, that will have a large impact on the organization.
And this can also be just the IT department saying, we will no longer be assisting in projects just on an ad hoc basis for the business, because we don't have the resources for this. And this should reduce cost, or at least shed a light on where there's a demand for services and stuff like that.
Yeah, and here we have some of our classical cost out hypotheses to get you started. We've organized them so it ranges from some of the less impactful levers, so the right sizing hypothesis, all the way to the cost move hypothesis. And I mean, where we will always start and where we will always pretty much always find something is that if you're looking for overcapacity in the infrastructure, when you analyze server utilization, disk usage, and so on, you will probably identify something that is underutilized and that you can cost. And you want to take the next one, Mads?
Yeah, and you can say that this is the right sizing. This is something you can. We have a lot of webcasts on software as well, and this is some principle which is also very applicable when looking at software. You analyze all of your options. You are analyzing the utilization of not only servers but also licenses and stuff like that.
And of course, we want everybody out there to pay the right price for all their contracts. So, and we will often find, due to decreasing prices over time and contracts that have been running for many years and so on without sufficient price regulation, that the contracts are above the current market price. So, in that case, you should health check, you should benchmark, and you should renegotiate. And specifically around software costs. So, for example, on your Microsoft agreement, there are often, I mean, you'd be surprised at the variability that you see in these kinds of agreements, and there are often quite significant savings to be had there.
Then you're looking at the standardization lever, so to say, and here there's a bunch of different ways of going about it. You look at something like AMS, which is the application maintenance, and often we see that you can significantly reduce overall cost by tying the declining activity levels to the pricing. So what we are, for example, seeing in many contracts is that you go into an agreement for some application maintenance and there's a fixed price over the entire contract period, and the contract ends up being extended a bunch of times without regulating the price. But the dynamics of the application maintenance is that this activity will decrease by a lot over time. The application will mature, as we call it, and you as a customer should reap some of the rewards of that in the pricing. So tying the pricing to the activity either on an hourly basis or on a per incident basis, this is something that you can experience a lot of cost out actually, especially if the contract has been running for a long time.
And regarding also standardization of the contract terms, this is the example I was thinking about before, is that often if you go through all of your contracts, you will find that there are some terms that might have just put in there because they were nice to have, but in this case you're looking at the need to have basically, and you will often find that, for example, if you look at a lot of your contracts, they have been entered with a lot of flexibility because that was nice to have, but in a cost out situation, you need to consider whether this is still a need to have. And we will actually share with you in one of the next slides how we would suggest that you can do this yourself to get a complete overview on all of your contracts.
And basically, one of the most important things in a cost out exercise is this nice to have versus need to have discussion. because when you're looking for cost savings, you want to focus on having the lowest amount of nice to haves as you can, or at the very least be informed on how much it's impacting the price if you choose to include it. Then we have another one in standardization, which is something like overlapping functionality between hardware, software platforms. This is something we see some clients have where they have a lot of different systems doing some of the same things, basically. And they might have 3 applications which is used in different parts of the business, but where the overall functionality of the system is quite pretty much the same. And there you can receive savings by consolidating to the fewest possible amounts of systems.
But in this area, there's also basically the other significant trend in the last few years, which is basically from a lot of the software as a service vendors, which is bundling of their software product suites, or what you might call it, which is leading to a lot of things that aren't used or that might be overlapping. I think we're going to skip to the next slide, because you have the cost art hypothesis here. But the last thing that we want to talk about today is basically our do-it-yourself, I think. Actually, no, there's just one shameless plug here, which is basically all these analysis. This is, of course, something that we can help you with. We can do cloud utilization analysis, software analysis. We can do benchmarking of the internal setups, and we can help you with system functionality screening and so on. But what we want to spend some time on here as one of the last things today is basically our framework and basically our contract multiplier framework, which, if you've seen our webcast before, if you've been involved with any of our benchmarking products, you will have seen this before. But these are the 12 areas of a contract, terms and conditions, that we always look at, because they're the key price driving terms.
Yes, and this is obviously the structure here is that you're looking at a column showing you the standard terms for each area. There's a column showing what deviates from standard, which has what we call the medium effect on the price, and there's the special conditions, which has a high effect on the price. And the overall message here is that in such a cost out situation, you want to have as few of the deviations from standard and with as few special conditions as possible. And I think what the overall principle here is that you as a client will be paying for increased risk on the contract. So if you want to be able to have unlimited downward flexibility in terms of capacity in an outsourced agreement, then you will pay for this by having higher unit prices. So every time you include a contract term in your contract which increases the risk of the vendor, then you will be paying for this. And this can be this can be used in a cost out setting, because you can review all of your contracts and you can identify all of the contract terms which might be pushing up the price on each contract.
Yeah, and we actually have this example. It can be a little bit difficult to see, but in this example, we actually reviewed more than 10 contracts at a large corporation, and then we mapped out in this framework each of these areas. So what was the capacity flexibility of the contract? What did the price model look like? Did they have design authority and so on for all of the contracts? And then you get this kind of picture which basically outlines all of the areas where you might want to standardize or look to changing your terms. And if we go through them one at a time, the first column here, and it's a little bit small, but this is regarding the capacity flexibility. And what we find there is that a lot of contracts are entered with this, they want unlimited downward flexibility. But a lot of the time, it's just something that's put in there without considering the price impact, and often it's due to clients not really knowing where they're going. But I mean, you can say that it's also just insufficient planning. Of course, there are times where there is uncertainty and then you need the flexibility, but especially when you combine this with the commitment period on the contract, if you enter a contract with a short, so less than 3 years binding term, and you also have unlimited flexibility, well, then you should have a really good reason for that. And that's just what we're saying here, is that you should have a really good reason to put these kind of terms into your contract, because they are really driving costs. And a lot of times, for example, there might have been uncertainty on the first contract term, so the first 3-4 years or whatever. But when you're renewing the contract, you don't need this kind of flexibility anymore, because you actually know that, okay, we're going to continue in this direction for the next 3-4 years or whatever that is.
And this is actually just to circle back a little bit what we discussed previously. If you have made a prognosis of all your capacity and you know that you expect it to increase by a lot, then you need to consider whether you really need something like downward flexibility, right? Especially if you have a short contract.
And what we hear is that often this kind of capacity flexibility term is put into the contract because there is uncertainty around one specific area. But in that case, there are better ways to handle that. So you might know that, okay, this system is maybe going to be closed, or we're going to divest this part of the company, but you could put in special obligations in the contract regarding that and not have this uncertainty around the whole engagement.
Because vendors will capitalize risk in this way.
Exactly. If we're looking at some of these more middling parts of the multiplier, these are some of the areas where it can actually be more difficult to change, but often you need to look at ways to standardize. So for example, if you have put in certain demands around how the supplier should deliver these services, so you're putting in select demands around design authority, or you're putting in demands around special reporting requirements and so on, then you need to consider whether those were actually still required, or whether you can remove some of these individual variability and therefore allow the supplier to deliver at a more favorable price.
Yeah, so the idea here is that the cheapest thing for the vendors, suppliers, is to go to just deliver their standard solutions for something like the governance model and the reporting structure and stuff like that. So you want to, it should once again be, you should have a very good reason for asking the vendor to do something which is outside of their standard. If you have a benchmarking clause in your contract, of course we believe that you should use it, but be also aware that this is actually one of those things where it can actually drive costs if you have automatic price adjustments as a consequence of benchmarking. But if you put that kind of clause in your contract and then you don't use it, well then you're just paying for nothing basically. So if you have a benchmarking clause, then you should use it, because it can really help you out. Regarding the penalty, this is one of those areas where a lot of the times contracts are entered with a really tough penalty. It can sometimes even be more than 30% of the monthly fee, and oftentimes it's put in because it's not really considered whether this will impact on the price. The client just wants to say, we don't want our stuff to go down at any point. And often it's one of those areas, specifically with IT, where the availability is quite high on a lot of services. So a lot of the time you're just shooting yourself in the foot if you're putting a really high penalty. At least the rewards are marginal, is our take on this. Yeah, and then finally, you are some of the terms which can drive prices, stuff like what personnel can the vendor use, where should the data center be located, and then special security demands. Here, you want to make sure that you are not limiting the vendor's use of resources or data centers, or you're not setting security demands, which aren't required for your situation, right? Obviously, there's a lot of good reasons where you might want to have a doubling of data centers, and the data center and demanding that the data center should be placed in Denmark and stuff like that. But you should be aware that it causes the prices to increase because the vendor will capitalize this, and you should only do this if it's required, either by legislation or by the business needs.
I think actually that was some of the key points that we wanted to touch upon today. We've talked a little bit about the effects of the increasing software prices, and basically our takeaway from all this and our recommendation is that you should have a plan B. You should know your dependencies, you should map out the alternatives, you should be prepared to execute on your best alternative. That's really the takeaway from today. But otherwise, I think we're going to say thank you for today. Thank you for listening in.
Yes.
And
have a nice day, everyone.